Before we begin our study of Genesis 6, I want to call attention to something that I've mentioned, I think, in passing before. A biography of Gus Nichols has just been released, and it was written by Scott Harp, a good friend of mine who also is a gospel preacher, and he runs the website called therestorationmovement.com. If you do not have therestorationmovement.com bookmarked on your computers, you need to do that. It is an invaluable resource, and it's updated constantly. Restoration leaders and figures and subjects, and it's an outstanding resource. Scott has written this book that has just come out, this biography of Gus Nichols, called The Sage of Jasper. And I received it in the mail Thursday of last week, and I'm already about maybe a quarter through the book. It's that kind of read. You don't want to put it down. I try to put it down and keep on picking it back up and reading it. And it's an outstanding book. Yes, sir?
You may not realize it, but his father used to be the preacher for this congregation approximately when he was very young.
Wow. That's Richard you're talking about, Richard Harp. Yes, his son's name is Richard too, by the way. Richard preaches at the congregation where I used to preach in Birmingham, Scott's son. Scott has done an outstanding job with this book thus far that I've read. This cover picture that you see of Brother Nichols had never been seen since 1973. The family didn't even know it existed. Brother Nichols had a photo shoot done in Walker County in the early 1970s. And Scott went to visit the man who is still living that took the photos, and he got out all the pictures, and this one caught Scott's eye, and he said, that picture's not seen the light of day since I took it. He said, can I use it for the cover photo? He said, certainly. And the family had never seen that picture. I think that captures Brother Nichols, if you can make it out from where you're sitting, with his hat on and with his Bible in his hand, and the expression on his face. It just captures him. This book is excellent, and you would want it. You can order a copy through therestorationmovement.com. It's worth every penny that you pay for it. You pay for the book and for the shipping, and he will send it to you within short order. It's over 550 pages, or in other words, the length of one of Brother Gus's sermons. But as it is, it's an excellent read, and you will want it for your library, and I recommend it highly. Genesis chapter 6 is where we are, and we left off, I believe, at verse 17. Before we start, let me point out one more thing. I've mentioned to you about the cubit measurement and how that I have a ruler that is an exact cubit. Well, this is it. It's a roll. You see this roll? Well, when you open it up, it becomes a ruler. This was published put out by the Gospel Advocate Company in the 1960s. B.C. Goodpasture was the editor of the Advocate, and of course he would come out with a cubit ruler. If you put the cubit ruler at the tip of my elbow, it goes all the way to the tip of my middle finger, 18 inches exactly. That is the length of the cubit, 18 inches, the average length of a man's elbow to his middle finger. So when you see the measurements of the ark, and you see the measurements in the Old Testament of a cubit, this is it. Now, up there at the ark encounter, they gave their version of a cubit. And I've got it. It's a wooden stick that is not 18 inches long. It's much longer than 18 inches. In fact, I believe it's in between the regular cubit and the royal cubit. And I don't know where they got that measurement. It's sure not from the Bible. But there are two cubits mentioned, which is the regular cubit and the royal cubit. This, the 18-inch version, is the regular cubit, and that was the measurement that was used for Noah when he was commanded to build the ark. I thought that was an interesting thing. I thought you might be interested in that, and I can show it to you. You can't have it. It's mine. But anyway, you can see it. Genesis 6:17 says, behold, I, even I, am bringing the flood of water upon the earth, to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life. From under heaven, everything that is on the earth shall perish. I'm going to wipe it out, is what God is saying. Everything that is on the earth, all flesh, everything is going to be eliminated. Now, last week I brought up the speculation, just my own speculation, as to the lost continent of Atlantis. You've heard that mythology surrounding Atlantis and all that has been written about it in ancient writings. I brought up the possibility that it could be one of those areas of land that was totally eradicated by the Lord in the flood. It's as much of a possibility as any. It's just speculation on my part. But could it well be that that area was one of the focal points where all of this evil originated and spread throughout the entire earth? We don't know for certain. Won't know for certain until after the Lord comes again. But still, it's something to think about. He says, everything that is on the earth shall perish. Everything. All of it's going to be eradicated. Peter would talk about the world that then was, that is prior to the flood, perished. But the world that is now is reserved unto judgment. And that's something to think about, especially when we come to the text concerning the flood itself. So keep that in mind as we get closer to it. Verse 18 then says, "But I will establish my covenant with you." Notice, my covenant. That's the first mention of the word covenant in the Bible. It's right there. Covenant is an agreement between two parties. Normally one of those parties is the greater and the other is the lesser. In this sense, God says, I will establish my covenant with you. That's not going to be the last time that we see that phrase, covenant, brought up in this book by far. But this is the first time that it indeed is mentioned. "And you shall enter the ark, you and your sons, and your wife, and your sons' wives with you." Those are the ones that God says will enter the ark. No one else. And so when the movie came out about Noah with Russell Crowe, and they had the stowaway on the ark that got into a fight with Noah on the ark, complete and utter fiction. It's not according to Scripture. It's interesting to me that the guy that made that movie was a pronounced skeptic of the Bible. In fact, I believe he was at least an agnostic, if not an atheist. And so he took much liberty with the biblical text and added many things to make it a more exciting movie that completely ruined it. If he had just stuck with the Genesis account, it would have been enough to make it a very exciting movie and a very appealing movie to a lot of people. Yet he had to add all that other stuff to it. But here he specifies it's Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives. That's all. Those are the only people that will be on the ark. "And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female." This is the generic command, the one that we are far more familiar with in connection with Noah. Noah brought all the animals in 2 by 2, and of course that is the case. This is exactly where God commands it. But that's not the only command concerning the animals, as we will see, that is given to Noah. It is often overlooked that there's something else that's told to Noah. We read further. "Of the birds after their kind, and of the animals after their kind, of every creeping thing of the ground after its kind, 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive." 2 by 2 of every creeping thing, and of the animals and the birds. So it seems here like he's talking about all of the animals. But again, there's something else that we're going to be coming across, and we will see that shortly. "As for you," he says, talking about Noah now, particularly in his family. "As for you, take for yourself some of all food which is edible, and gather it to yourself, and it shall be for food for you and for them." So he's told, commanded by God, to gather some food. How much food? Some food. Does he give a specific amount of food to Noah? No. He says some food. Well, how much food? "It shall be for food for you," that is for Noah and his family, "and for them." Them who? The animals. So he had to gather up enough food to last for him, his family, and the animals. That's a lot of food. More than we would think when we think of the word some. Still, it's a lot of food that Noah would have to gather, but he would have plenty of time to do it. He would have plenty of time to do all of this. And what does Moses say at the end of chapter 6? Thus Noah did, according to all that God had commanded him, so he did. Now let's look at this. In chapter 6, we saw in verse 8 that Noah found favor or grace in the eyes of the Lord. So there was grace in Genesis 6. Then we find, beginning with verse 14, that God gives Noah specific instructions on how to build the ark. He gives Noah a law to follow. So you've got grace in verse 8. You've got law beginning of verse 13 and going down several verses. And then here at the end of chapter 6, thus Noah did. According to all that God commanded him, so he did. There was works on Noah's part. So you've got grace in verse 8. You've got a law in verses 13 and following. And then you've got works in the very last verse. Grace, law, and works in Genesis 6. Now some of my brethren say that grace, law, and works cannot coincide with each other. They mutually exclude one another. No, that's not the case. Grace does not exclude law, and it does not exclude works. Of course, that's a discussion really that focuses on the New Testament as far as we are concerned. But the principle of grace, law, and works working side by side, hand in hand, is set forth right here in Genesis 6. Grace, law, and works. Any questions or comments before we get into chapter 7, before we move into the flood itself? All right, Genesis 7, beginning of verse 1. Then the Lord said to Noah, enter the ark, you and all your household. For you alone I have seen to be righteous before me in this time. So there comes the time when Noah is commanded by God to enter into the ark. All of your family enter, because you I have seen to be righteous. Now, what was Noah doing all of this time? About 100 years it took, a little over 100 years for him to build the ark. What was he doing? Of course, he was building the ark using what God had instructed him to do, and also things that were left to his own judgment, the tools that he could use, the help that he could hire out, and all the things that went along with that. But there was something else he was doing. Noah was doing something else all the time that he was building the ark. And in fact, Peter tells us what he was doing in the book of 2 Peter. In 2 Peter chapter 2, what does Peter say about Noah? 2 Peter chapter 2, particularly at verse 5. And did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. Notice that. Peter says that Noah was a preacher. So the entire time that Noah was building the ark for 100 years, what was he doing? He was preaching. He was preaching righteousness to the people who were then living. Now you picture in your mind, Noah is preaching as the ark is being built. And there's a gentleman that walks down the road near where the ark is being built, and he has a little boy next to him, and the little boy looks over where Noah is and hears him preaching, tugs on his daddy's cloak and says, "Who's he?" And the man says, "Don't pay any attention to him, son. He was preaching the same thing when I was your age. Just don't pay attention to him." Isn't that what really happened? Because that entire generation, all of those people who were living during the time that Noah was preaching, did not listen. They did not change. And that was the problem. The problem was that God knew that that entire generation, all that earth, had to be wiped out. The slate had to be started back over. So, he says, you alone I have seen to be righteous before me in this time. And in fact, in the New Testament, Matthew 24:38, Hebrews 11:7, 1 Peter 3:20, and again 2 Peter 2, as we alluded to, talks about the fact that Noah was righteous. By faith, Noah, Hebrews 11 tells us. By faith, Noah built the ark. By faith. Faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of God. Noah did that exactly as God said. Good old Noah built an ark like God told him to, our children sing. And that song is so, so true indeed. Verse 2 then says, you shall take with you of every clean animal by sevens, a male and his female, and of the animals that are not clean, 2, a male and his female. Also of the birds of the sky by sevens, male and female, to keep offspring alive on the face of all the earth. So he's commanded to get 2 by 2 of all the animals there in chapter 6, and it's repeated here, but with an addition. 7 of every clean animal. Why that? Why was he told to get 7 of every clean animal and of every bird? Well, we're told in part the reason to keep offspring alive on the face of all the earth, of course. But there's another reason why. Sacrifice. Sacrifice. We're going to see the significance of clean and unclean throughout the Pentateuch, throughout the Torah. And so Noah is commanded by God to gather up 7 of every clean animal, which is a very fascinating thing indeed. I well remember Brother Rex Turner Sr. talking about this at length in the classes that I took under him and that many of us took under him at what is now Amherst University. He specified or really focused on that verse in talking about sacrifice and the principle of blood offering and the like. 7 of every clean animal. Verse 4. For after 7 more days I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. In other words, there's a week. You've got a week to do this. After 7 days I'm going to send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And I will blot out from the face of the land every living thing that I have made. Noah did according to all that the Lord had commanded him. Again, Moses emphasizes this. Noah did according to all that the Lord had commanded him. We are not told how Noah went about gathering all of the clean animals. Perhaps God assisted in that matter. We are not told. We simply know what Moses says. Noah did according to all that the Lord had commanded him. What a commentary. What a commentary on this man. Could it be said about us toward the end of our lives that, insert your name, did according to all that the Lord commanded him? Can it be said about us? Could it be said about us now that I have done according to all that the Lord has commanded us? Well, I can't obey the Lord perfectly, flawlessly. Of course, no one can. No one can obey the Lord flawlessly without mistakes. It's impossible. There's only one person that made no mistakes, and that was Jesus Christ. He was the only person with flawless obedience. We're not talking about flawless obedience. We're talking about obedience, where I do everything under my power to obey the will of the Lord. I'm not going to intentionally go against anything that the Lord has said. Can it be said about us what was said about Noah? That's a challenge. That's a challenge to me. And that should be a challenge to all of us, to do as Noah did. Now, Moses, yes sir, Brother Don. Yes. John tells us that we are to walk in the light as he is in the light. Noah no doubt walked in the light. And we can also walk in the light. We can demonstrate the faith of Noah in the sense that we obey what the Lord has commanded us to obey. And that's the type of disposition that we need to have. I don't want to keep on harping on it, but when I think of someone in our day and time or of modern day that exemplifies someone who tried his best to live according to what the Lord said, it would be Brother Nichols. Brother Nichols was a man that if you knew him, you knew that everything he did was in obedience to the Lord, or as much as he possibly could. He made his mistakes, and he would admit that, as we all do. But still, here was a man who was humble, who was meek, who knew his limitations, and knew his abilities, and who knew more importantly, and most importantly, what the Lord expected. May it be said of all of us that we are striving to walk in the light and that we're trying to do what the Lord has commanded us to do. Verse 6 then says, "Now Noah was 600 years old when the flood of water came upon the earth." So he's 600 years old when the flood comes. "Then Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him entered the ark. Because of the water of the flood, only 8 people are entering that huge boat." And I can imagine in my mind's eye when that first drop of water fell. That was the signal to Noah to gather his family together and get in the ark. Because here it comes. It has never rained before, remember. It has never come a rain up until this point. And now the water is beginning to drop from the sky. And it's getting faster and faster and faster. And Noah knows he's got to get his family in. And so he does. Verse 8, "Of clean animals and animals that are not clean, and birds and everything that creeps on the ground, there went into the ark to Noah by twos, male and female, as God had commanded Noah." Apparently Noah and his boys and his family had gathered up those animals, perhaps with God's assistance. They're already ready to go into the ark, and now at the set time, they enter. They enter in. We're not told how old these animals were, by the way. We're also not told how big these animals were. They could very well have been very young animals, which would have taken up much less space inside the ark. That's something that's overlooked. There's plenty of space within the ark, as we know, to house all of the animals that would come in, all these land animals and air animals. But they did not have to be fully grown. Notice, he says 2 of every animal and 7 of every clean, but it didn't say of every adult animal. So they could very well have been very young and very small animals when they came upon that boat. At any rate, verse 10 then says, "It came about after the 7 days that the water of the flood came upon the earth." So after the 7 days is up, he told him 7 days and it's going to come a rain. The 7 days is up, the rain starts, Noah and his family enters in, all the animals enter in. Verse 11, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month," Moses specifies the time, "on the same day all the fountains of the great deep burst open." Moses here is referring to the vast subterranean sources of water that are underneath the earth. They open up. And then it says, on the same day, or the floodgates of the sky were opened. The waters, remember, that were above the expanse, that great water canopy that surrounded the earth apparently, God opens up the heavens and all of that rain, all that water comes crashing down upon the earth. So you got water coming down from the sky, water coming up from under the earth. The flood is now upon them. The rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. The Hebrew text, that word rain, that's translated in your Bible, indicates a hard, driving rain. I'm sure that you have driven in your life through hard, driving rain periodically. It is not fun. It's not fun at all. Especially when your windshield wipers aren't working properly, as they should. You can get scared to death if you're caught out in the interstate in that kind of rain, or anywhere for that matter. Well, here we have 40 days and 40 nights. I remember Hurricane Frederick hit the Gulf Coast. You remember that back in the early 80s, I believe 1980, perhaps 81, when Frederick hit? I think David had come through not far away from Mobile, and then Frederick had made a direct hit upon the Gulf Coast and went straight up, looked like the Alabama-Mississippi border, came right through Lamar County, came right through Vernon, the after effects of it. You talk about hard driving rain that lasted for a long time. Oh yes, that indeed was the case. But everything that we can think of in our own lifetime, all the hard storms, all the driving rain, pales by comparison with this. 40 days and 40 nights of rain and all that water coming up from under the earth. On the very same day, Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark. So that same day that the rain started, that the flood began, on that same day they enter into the ark. They and every beast after its kind, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, and every bird after its kind, all sorts of birds. So they went into the ark to Noah by twos of all flesh, in which was the breath of life. Additionally, as Moses has already mentioned, the clean beasts and the clean birds also have entered into the ark. Those that entered, male and female of all flesh, entered as God had commanded him, and the Lord closed it behind him. When that door closed, no one could open it. When the book of Revelation mentions a door which no man can shut and which no man can open but I think about this. When God shut the door of the ark, no one could open it but the Lord. And that was for protective purposes, to protect Noah and his family. Can't you imagine when all that rain started, the flood was coming, and all the people realized that they were going to drown, that they were not going to live? Can't you realize and imagine in your mind the mass of humanity that would come to the ark wanting in? Beating on the sides of the ark, wanting in, pleading, begging for their lives. But Noah and his family had no control over that door. God was the one who shut it. And God was the one who sealed them in. Because he had determined that all of that earth was going to be eradicated. Verse 17. Then the flood came upon the earth for 40 days, and the water increased and lifted up the ark so that it rose above the earth. So the water gets to the point where the ark that up to this point had been resting upon whatever structure that Noah and his family had built, all of a sudden the water begins to lift up that boat. And then Moses says the water prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. Remember, this boat was not designed to sail the 7 seas. This boat was designed for one purpose and for one purpose only, and that was to float. You know, when I was a little boy, I loved to take a bath, and I loved to bring with me some boats in the bathtub, you know, little boats that I had. And I would try my best to sink those boats to keep them underneath the water, and what you know, all those boats kept on coming up to the surface. They were designed to float. Same thing with an empty egg carton. Empty egg carton is one of the best things that you can use for a boat. I know from experience. And you can't get that thing to sink unless you poke a lot of holes in it. But still, those things are designed for one purpose, and that's to float. The ark was designed for that purpose, to float. And it had been pitched within or without with pitch. Whatever that pitch was, sealed it, where no water would get inside it. Our friends at Apologetics Press have done a masterful job at talking about all the scientific specifications behind the ark and all of the things that go in with this. And why the Noah story is true and why the flood story is true. By the way, Noah did not borrow from Babylonian flood stories. There's a Babylonian flood story called the Enuma Elish, and skeptical scholars have said, well, Moses just borrowed from that and just used it in his book. No, he didn't. No, he did not. My thought is that the Enuma Elish is describing the great event that happened that Moses describes here. But it's from the perspective of Babylonian gods and goddesses. It is different in highly significant ways from the Genesis account. What the Genesis account is doing is refuting all of the pagan accounts of the flood and is stating exactly what happened. God destroyed the earth and he saved Noah and his family. Notice verse 19. The water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. So the water keeps on rising, keeps on rising, keeps on rising. You know, I remember one time when I came down here when I was working on my master's way back in 87, I believe it was, fall of 87. It had come a massive rainstorm. And if you remember, the Alabama River, I believe, had overflowed its banks. At least some of the backwater had. And that straightaway that you go down I-65 right before you get to Montgomery, the water had actually reached up almost to the interstate. I'll never forget that. That was very hazardous, shall we say. Very intimidating to look at that. And you've seen different flood situations. But this far outstrips it. All of the mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. All, Moses says. It's not just the mountains that Noah could see. Some who say that the flood was a local flood say, well, it's just what all Noah could see. No, Moses says all the mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. What is he saying? He is saying to us that you take the highest mountain that you could think of and add 15 cubits. That's how high the water got. 15 cubits higher than all the mountains. Now remember, the world that then was perished. But the world that is now is reserved to judgment. So the mountain ranges in Noah's day were far different than the mountain ranges of our day. At any rate, the water covered all the mountains everywhere. Well, I'll say more about that here in a moment. Verse 21. All flesh that moved on the earth perished, birds and cattle and beasts and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth and all mankind. All flesh died. All of it drowned. Of all that was on the dry land, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, died. Thus he blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, and they were blotted out from the earth, and only Noah was left, together with those that were with him in the ark. The water prevailed upon the earth 150 days. Now think about it. 40 days and 40 nights the rain comes and the waters of the deep, the subterranean waters, come up. For 110 days after the rain ended, the waters continued to rise. So you've got 150 days total that flood water rose and rose and rose and prevailed and destroyed everything until it began to come back down, as Moses is going to describe in chapter 8. Now, I alluded to the fact that there are those today that say that the flood was a local flood. And they denied that the flood was universal. If you remember the debate that I had with Don Preston a couple of years ago, I found an endorsement that he wrote to a book concerning the flood, in which he writes, "Sacred cows die hard, yet this work by Martin and Vaughn has fired some heavy-duty shots at two sacred cows, prophetic futurism, and the global flood young earth view of Genesis. That is to say, Preston was saying it's a sacred cow to believe that the flood was global. A sacred cow. The claim was made in the book that Genesis chapters 1 and 2 was a myth or an allegory. But we've seen that kind of thought process come up before. Abilene Christian College, then Abilene Christian University in the mid-1980s had a couple of professors on their graduate program that taught that Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3 are myths and that the flood is not a universal flood. They denied it. The administration denied it publicly. Now internal documents have surfaced that show that indeed they did an investigation, and yes, they were teaching that exactly as it had been charged. And you've got those kinds of thoughts that enter into people's minds, and they try to promote it and teach it, and it completely runs afoul of what Moses says. Moses says to us what happened. And then when Jesus talks about it in Matthew 24 in connection with the destruction of Jerusalem and the final judgment, he says it's universal. And then Peter caps it off by saying, the world that then was perished. It's over. It ended. But the world that is now is reserved to judgment. The world in which we live today is different, far different, physically, from the world that existed before the flood. The world that is now will be what is destroyed at the end of time. Again, how far and how advanced does civilization get? We can't really say. Yes, sir. Amen.
When the Lord says, depart from me, I never knew you. Now that's what's sad.
It's overwhelming to think about the final day of judgment when it comes. The separation that's going to be made, the great separation the Lord will make between those on the right and those on the left, but exactly what you're talking about. All of those that have had all their life to change their lives and obey the gospel or to come back to the Lord before it's too late, and time after time after time they've rejected, and then the day of judgment comes and they realize they need to change, and by then it's too late, just like it was for the people in the day of Noah. That's the overwhelming tragic thing. And if that doesn't give you a sense of urgency, if that doesn't give you a sense of urgency for the souls of man because of sin, if that doesn't put in your mind the awareness that we've got to get the gospel message out, then I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. Because the Lord has made it incumbent upon us to take the gospel into the entire world, because the day of judgment, the final day of judgment, is coming. And when the Lord comes, no more opportunities. When the Lord comes, no more chances. When the Lord comes, no more invitation songs, no more preaching is going to be done, no more teaching is going to be done. It's over. We've got to make sure, brethren, right now that our lives are what they ought to be, so that we ourselves can meet the Lord with confidence, and that we can bring as many people with us to the Lord as we possibly can. Absolutely. It was tragic for those people that perished. And I'm sure it broke Noah's heart and broke his wife's heart to hear the pathetic cries and the screams of all those people that wanted in, but who could not. But yet, the Lord had decided that generation's gone. It's gone. It's done. What I wonder is he going to decide in our own lifetime? Is he going to make that decision? It's done. With a snap of his finger, as it were, with the sound of his voice, it'll happen. We've got to make ready. We've got to be ready. Make preparation for it. Any other comments, questions? We've got about 5 minutes left before we, yes. Right. It could very well be, as you mentioned, that family was involved, that they had not listened to Noah up to this point. Now they're wanting to come in, and they can't. Methuselah, as we mentioned, Methuselah lived 969 years, and if you do the math, he died in the year that the flood came. Now, when in that year? Moses doesn't tell us. Did he die in the flood, or did he die before the flood came? I would hope it was before the flood came. But the very real possibility, as you mentioned, Stan, is that there were family members that perished. And that would add to the tragedy of the whole situation. But, again, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah and his family alone were righteous of all the people that were on the earth at that moment in time. You know, we think the world's gotten bad. And it has, to a large extent. The world's gotten bad. The world's gotten unrighteous to a great degree, but it hasn't gotten to the point of the flood. I guarantee. It hasn't gotten to the point where there's only 8 people that are righteous in the entire world. Still, it's incumbent upon us, as I mentioned before, to do what we must do and preach the truth and live it and try to bring as many people into the ark of safety, the church, as we possibly can. It's an interesting thing also to look at the similarities between the ark and the church. Very interesting study. Gaddis Roy was a teacher of mine. Many of you remember Brother Gaddis Roy. Brother Roy was an outstanding preacher and debater and educator, and he wrote a book called Types and Shadows, a book of sermons. And he talked in the class that I took under him about the flood and about Noah and the ark. And he said you got to be careful about how far you take that for a lot of reasons. But still, it's interesting to look at. I think the first bell should have rung, but it hasn't. So I'm going to say ding, ding, and ring the second bell. And we will then continue our study